Hi everyone, the Gazette has a new name. It's now called Nostalgia USA, and each month it's getting better. A real entertainment experience. And within each issue there will be special pricing on selected oldtimeradiodvd.com collections, only available to our subscribers of the Nostalgia USA. Take advantage today by subscribing at oldtimeradiodvd.com. Nostalgia USA, special pricing. What a combination. Go to oldtimeradiodvd.com today. You'll be glad you did.
Let's now join our featured presentation.
The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Chapter 2. The Session of 1849 and 1850, the Compromise Measures, Virtual Abrogation of the Missouri Compromise, the Admission of California, the Fugitive Slave Law, Death of Mr. Calhoun, Anecdote of Mr. Clay. The first session of the 31st Congress, 1849 and 1850, was a memorable one. The recent acquisition from Mexico of New Mexico and California required legislation by Congress. In the Senate the bills reported by the Committee on Territories were referred to a select committee, of which Mr. Clay, the distinguished senator from Kentucky, was chairman. From this committee emanated the bills which, taken together, are known as the Compromise Measures of 1850. With some others, I advocated the division of the newly acquired territory by an extension to the Pacific Ocean of the Missouri Compromise line of 36 degrees and 30 minutes north latitude. This was not because of any inherent merit or fitness in that line, but because it had been accepted by the country as a settlement of the sectional question which, 30 years before, had threatened a rupture of the Union, and it had acquired in the public mind a prescriptive respect which it seemed unwise to disregard. A majority, however, decided otherwise, and the line of political conciliation was then obliterated, as far as it lay in the power of Congress to do so. An analysis of the vote will show that this result was effected almost exclusively by the representatives of the North, and that the South was not responsible for an action which proved to be the opening of Pandora's box. Footnote: the vote in the Senate on the proposition to continue the line of the Missouri Compromise through the newly acquired territory to the Pacific was 24 yeas to 32 nays. Reckoning Delaware and Missouri as Southern States, the vote of the two sections was exactly equal. The yeas were all cast by Southern senators, the nays were all Northern, except 2 from Delaware, 1 from Missouri, and 1 from Kentucky. However objectionable it may have been in 1820 to adopt that political line as expressing a geographical definition of different sectional interests, and however it may be condemned as the assumption by Congress of a function not delegated to it, it is to be remembered that the act had received such recognition and quasi-ratification by the people of the States as to give it a value which it did not originally possess. Pacification had been the fruit borne by the tree, and it should not have been recklessly hewed down and cast into the fire. The frequent assertion then made was that all discrimination was unjust, and that the popular will should be left untrammeled in the formation of new States. The theory was good enough in itself, and as an abstract proposition could not be gainsaid, but its practical operation has but poorly sustained the expectation of its advocates, as will be seen when we come to consider the events that occurred a few years later in Kansas and elsewhere. Retrospectively viewed under the mellowing light of time, and with the calm consideration we can usually give to the irremediable past, the compromise legislation of 1850 bears the impress of that sectional spirit so widely at variance with the general purposes of the Union, and so destructive of the harmony and mutual benefit which the Constitution was intended to secure. The refusal to divide the territory acquired from Mexico by an extension of the line of the Missouri Compromise to the Pacific was a consequence of the purpose to admit California as a State of the Union before it had acquired the requisite population, and while it was mainly under the control of a military organization sent from New York during the war with Mexico and disbanded in California upon the restoration of peace. The inconsistency of the argument against the extension of the line was exhibited in the division of the territory of Texas by that parallel, and payment to the State of money to secure her consent to the partition of her domain. In the case of Texas, the North had everything to gain and nothing to lose by the application of the practice of geographical compromise on the arbitrary line. In the case of California, the conditions were reversed. The South might have been the gainer and the North the loser by a recognition of the same rule. The compensation which it was alleged that the South received was a more effective law for the rendition of fugitives from service or labor. But it is to be remarked that this law provided for the execution by the general government of obligations which had been imposed by the federal compact upon the several States of the Union. The benefit to be derived from a fulfillment of that law would be small in comparison with the evil to result from the plausible pretext that the States had thus been relieved from a duty which they had assumed in the adoption of the compact of union. Whatever tended to lead the people of any of the States to feel that they could be relieved from their constitutional obligations by transferring them to the general government, or that they might thus or otherwise evade or resist them, could not fail to be like the tares which the enemy sowed amid the wheat. The Union of States, formed to secure the permanent welfare of posterity and to promote harmony among the constituent States, could not, without changing its character, survive such alienation as rendered its parts hostile to the security, prosperity, and happiness of one another. It was reasonably argued that, as the legislatures of 14 of the States had enacted what were termed "personal liberty laws," which forbade the cooperation of State officials in the rendition of fugitives from service and labor, it became necessary that the general government should provide the requisite machinery for the execution of the law. The result proved what might have been anticipated, that those communities which had repudiated their constitutional obligations, which had nullified a previous law of Congress for the execution of a provision of the Constitution, and had murdered men who came peacefully to recover their property, would evade or obstruct, so as to render practically worthless, any law that could be enacted for that purpose. In the exceptional cases in which it might be executed, the event would be attended with such conflict between State and Federal authorities as to produce consequent evils greater than those it was intended to correct. It was during the progress of these memorable controversies that the South lost its most trusted leader, and the Senate its greatest and purest statesman. He was taken from us, "like a summer-dried fountain when our need was the sorest." When his intellectual power, his administrative talent, his love of peace, and his devotion to the Constitution might have averted collision, or, failing in that, he might have been to the South the Palinurus to steer the bark in safety over the perilous sea. Truly did Mr. Webster, his personal friend, although his greatest political rival, say of him in his obituary address, "There was nothing groveling, or low, or meanly selfish, that came near the head or the heart of Mr. Calhoun." His prophetic warnings speak from the grave with the wisdom of inspiration. Would that they could have been appreciated by his countrymen while he yet lived! Note: While the compromise measures of 1850 were pending, and the excitement concerning them was at its highest, I one day overtook Mr. Clay of Kentucky and Mr. Berrien of Georgia in the Capitol grounds. They were in earnest conversation. It was the 7th of March, the day on which Mr. Webster had delivered his great speech. Mr. Clay, addressing me in the friendly manner which he had always employed since I was a schoolboy in Lexington, asked me what I thought of the speech. I liked it better than he did. He then suggested that I should "join the compromise men," saying that it was a measure which he thought would probably give peace to the country for 30 years, the period that had elapsed since the adoption of the Compromise of 1820. Then, turning to Mr. Berrien, he said, "You and I will be under ground before that time, but our young friend here may have trouble to meet." I somewhat impatiently declared my unwillingness to transfer to posterity a trial which they would be relatively less able to meet than we were, and passed on my way. End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3. Re-election to the Senate. Public controversies in Mississippi. Action of the Democratic State Convention. Defeat of the State Rights Party. Withdrawal of General Quitman and nomination of the author as candidate for the office of governor. The canvass and its result. Retirement to private life. I had been re-elected by the legislature of Mississippi as my own successor, and entered upon a new term of service in the Senate on March 4, 1851. On my return to Mississippi in 1851, the subject chiefly agitating the public mind was that of the compromise measures of the previous year. Consequent upon these was a proposition for a convention of delegates from the people of the Southern States respectively, to consider what steps ought to be taken for their future peace and safety, and the preservation of their constitutional rights. There was diversity of opinion with regard to the merits of the measures referred to, but the disagreement no longer followed the usual lines of party division. They who saw in those measures the forerunner of disaster to the South had no settled policy beyond a convention, the object of which should be to devise new and more effectual guarantees against the perils of usurpation. They were unjustly charged with the desire to destroy the Union, a feeling entertained by few, very few, if by any, in Mississippi, and avowed by none. There were many, however, who held that the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the purposes for which the Union was formed were of higher value than the mere Union itself. Independence existed before the compact of union between the states, and if that compact should be broken in
Section
part,
1 of
and
The Rise
therefore
and Fall of the
destroyed in
Confederate
whole,
Government.
it was hoped that the liberties of the people in the states might still be preserved. Those who were most devoted to the Union of the Constitution might, consequently, be expected to resist most sternly any usurpation of undelegated power, the effect of which would be to warp the federal government from its proper character, and by sapping the foundation, to destroy the Union of the States. My recent re-election to the United States Senate had conferred upon me for 6 years longer the office which I preferred to all others. I could not therefore be suspected of desiring a nomination for any other office from the Democratic Convention, the meeting of which was then drawing near. Having, as a senator of the State, freely participated in debate on the measures which were now exciting so much interest in the public mind, it was very proper that I should visit the people in different parts of the State and render an account of my stewardship. My devotion to the Union of our fathers had been so often and so publicly declared, I had, on the floor of the Senate, so defiantly challenged any question of my fidelity to it, my services, civil and military, had now extended through so long a period, and were so generally known, that I felt quite assured that no whisperings of envy or ill will could lead the people of Mississippi to believe that I had dishonored their trust by using the power they had conferred on me to destroy the government to which I was accredited. Then, as afterward, I regarded the separation of the States as a great, though not the greatest, evil. I returned from my tour among the people at the time appointed for the meeting of the nominating convention of the Democratic, or State Rights Party. During the previous year, the governor, General John A. Quitman, had been compelled to resign his office to answer an indictment against him for complicity with the filibustering expeditions against Cuba. The charges were not sustained. Many of the Democratic party of Mississippi, myself included, recognized a consequent obligation to renominate him for the office of which he had been deprived. When, however, the delegates met in party convention, The committee appointed to select candidates, on comparison of opinions, concluded that, in view of the effort to fix upon the party the imputation of a purpose of disunion, some of the antecedents of General Quitman might endanger success. A proposition was therefore made, in the Committee on Nominations, that I should be invited to become a candidate, and that if General Quitman should withdraw, my acceptance of the nomination and the resignation of my place in the United States Senate, which it was known would result, was to be followed by the appointment by the governor of General Quitman to the vacated place in the Senate. I offered no objection to this arrangement, but left it to General Quitman to decide. He claimed the nomination for the governorship or nothing, and was so nominated. To promote the success of the Democratic nominees, I engaged actively in the canvass, and continued in the field until stricken down by disease. This occurred just before the election of delegates to a state convention, for which provision had been made by the legislature, and the canvass for which, conducted in the main upon party lines, was in progress simultaneously with that for the ordinary state officers. The Democratic majority in the state, when the canvass began, was estimated at 8,000. At this election, in September, for delegates to the state convention, we were beaten by about 7,500 votes. Seeing in this result the foreshadowing of almost inevitable defeat, General Quitman withdrew from the canvass as a candidate, and the executive committee of the party, empowered to fill vacancies, called on me to take his place. My health did not permit me to leave home at that time, and only about 6 weeks remained before the election was to take place, but being assured that I was not expected to take any active part, and that the party asked only the use of my name, I consented to be announced, and immediately resigned from the United States Senate. Nevertheless, I soon afterward took the field in person, and worked earnestly until the day of election. I was defeated, but the majority of more than 7,000 votes that had been cast a short time before against the party with which I was associated was reduced to less than 1,000. Footnote 10. The following letter, written in 1853 to the Hon. William J. Brown of Indiana, formerly a member of Congress from that state, and subsequently published, relates to the events of this period, and affords nearly contemporaneous evidence in confirmation of the statements of the text. Washington, D.C., May 7th, 1853. My dear Sir, I received the Sentinel containing your defense of me against the late accusation of disunionism, and, before I had returned to you the thanks to which you are entitled, I received this day the St. Joseph Valley Register, marked by you, to call my attention to an article in answer to your defense, which was just in all things, save your too complimentary terms. I wish I had the letter quoted from, that you might publish the whole of that which is garbled, to answer a purpose. In a part of the letter not published, I put such a damper on the attempt to fix on me the desire to break up our Union, and presented other points in a form so little acceptable to the unfriendly inquirers, that the publication of the letter had to be drawn out of them. At the risk of being wearisome, but encouraged by your marked friendship, I will give you a statement in the case. The meeting of October, 1849, was a convention of delegates equally representing the Whig and Democratic parties in Mississippi. The resolutions were decisive as to equality of right in the South with the North to the territories acquired from Mexico, and proposed a convention of the Southern States. I was not a member, but on invitation addressed the convention. The succeeding legislature instructed me, as a senator, to assert this equality, and, under the existing circumstances, to resist by all constitutional means the admission of California as a state. At a called session of the legislature in 1850, a self-constituted committee called on me by letter for my views. They were men who had enacted or approved the resolutions of the convention of 1849, and instructed me, as members of the legislature in regular session, in the early part of the year 1850. To them I replied that I adhered to the policy they had indicated, and instructed me in their official character to pursue. I pointed out the mode in which their policy could, in my opinion, be executed without bloodshed or disastrous convulsion, but in terms of bitter scorn alluded to such as would insult me with a desire to destroy the Union, for which my whole life proved me to be a devotee. Pardon the egotism, in consideration of the occasion, when I say to you that my father and my uncles fought through the Revolution of 1776, giving their youth, their blood, and their little patrimony to the constitutional freedom which I claim as my inheritance. 3 of my brothers fought in the War of 1812. 2 of them were comrades of the hero of the Hermitage, and received his commendation for gallantry at New Orleans. At 16 years of age I was given to the service of my country. For 12 years of my life I have borne its arms and served it zealously, if not well. As I feel the infirmities which suffering more than age has brought upon me, it would be a bitter reflection indeed if I was forced to conclude that my countrymen would hold all this light when weighed against the empty panegyric which a time-serving politician can bestow upon the Union, for which he never made a sacrifice. In the Senate I announced that, if any respectable man would call me a disunionist, I would answer him in monosyllables, but I have often asserted the right, for which the battles of the Revolution were fought, the right of the people to change their government whenever it was found to be oppressive and subversive of the objects for which governments are instituted, and have contended for the independence and sovereignty of the States, a part of the creed of which Jefferson was the apostle, Madison the expounder, and Jackson the consistent defender. I have written freely, and more than I designed. Accept my thanks for your friendly advocacy. Present me in terms of kind remembrance to your family, and believe me very sincerely yours, Jefferson Davis. Note: no party in Mississippi ever advocated disunion. They differed as to the mode of securing their rights in the Union, and on the power of a State to secede, neither advocating the exercise of the power. J.D. End of footnote. In this canvass, both before and after I became a candidate, no argument or appeal of mine was directed against the perpetuation of the Union. Believing, however, that the signs of the time portended danger to the South from the usurpation by the general government of undelegated powers, I counseled that Mississippi should enter into the proposed meeting of the people of the Southern States, to consider what could and should be done to insure our future safety, frankly stating my conviction that, unless such action were taken then, sectional rivalry would engender greater evils in the future, and that if the controversy was postponed, the last opportunity for a peaceful solution would be lost. Then the issue would have to be settled by blood. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. The author enters the Cabinet. Administration of the War Department. Surveys for a Pacific Railway. Extension of the capital. New regiments organized. Colonel Samuel Cooper, Adjutant General. A bit of civil service reform. Re-election to the Senate. Continuity of the Pierce Cabinet. Character of Franklin Pierce. Happy in the peaceful pursuits of a planter, busily engaged in cares for servants, in the improvement of my land, in building, in rearing livestock, and the like occupations, the time passed pleasantly away until my retirement was interrupted by an invitation to take a place in the cabinet of Mr. Pierce, who had been elected to the presidency of the United States in November, 1852. Although warmly attached to Mr. Pierce personally, and entertaining the highest estimate of his character and political principles, private and personal reasons led me to decline the offer. This was followed by an invitation to attend the ceremony of his inauguration, which took place on the 4th of March, 1853. While in Washington on this visit, I was induced by public considerations to reconsider my determination and to accept the office of Secretary of War. The public records of that period will best show how the duties of that office were performed. While in the Senate, I had advocated the construction of a railway to connect the valley of the Mississippi with the Pacific coast, and when an appropriation was made to determine the most eligible route for that purpose, the Secretary of War was charged with its application. We had then but little of that minute and accurate knowledge of the interior of the continent which was requisite for a determination of the problem. Several different parties were therefore organized to examine the various routes supposed to be practicable within the northern and southern limits of the United States. The arguments which I had used as a senator were the military necessity for such means of transportation, and the need of safe and rapid communication with the Pacific slope to secure its continuance as a part of the Union. In the organization and equipment of these parties, and in the selection of their officers, care was taken to provide for securing full and accurate information upon every point involved in the determination of the route. The only discrimination made was in the more prompt and thorough equipment of the parties for the extreme northern line, and this was only because that was supposed to be the most difficult of execution of all the surveys. In like manner, my advocacy while in the Senate of an extension of the Capitol, by the construction of a new Senate Chamber and Hall of Representatives, may have caused the appropriation for that object to be put under my charge as Secretary of War. During my administration of the War Department, material changes were made in the models of arms. Iron gun carriages were introduced, and experiments were made which led to the casting of heavy guns hollow instead of boring them after casting. Inquiries were made with regard to gunpowder, which subsequently led to the use of a coarser grain for artillery. During the same period, the army was increased by the addition of 2 regiments of infantry and 2 of cavalry. The officers of these regiments were chosen partly by selection from those already in service in the regular army, and partly by appointment from civil life. In making the selections from the army, I was continually indebted to the assistance of that pure-minded and accurately informed officer, Colonel Samuel Cooper, the Adjutant General, of whom it may be proper here to say that, although his life had been spent in the army, and he, of course, had the likes and dislikes inseparable from men who are brought into close contact and occasional rivalry, I never found in his official recommendations any indication of partiality or prejudice toward any one. When the first list was made out to be submitted to the President, a difficulty was found to exist, which had not occurred either to Colonel Cooper or myself. This was, that the officers selected purely on their military record did not constitute a roster conforming to that distribution among the different states, which, for political considerations, it was thought desirable to observe. That is to say, the number of such officers of Southern birth was found to be disproportionately great. Under instructions from the President, the list was therefore revised and modified in accordance with this new element of geographical distribution. This, as I am happy to remember, was the only occasion in which the current of my official action while Secretary of War was disturbed in any way by sectional or political considerations. Under former administrations of the War Office, it had not been customary to make removals or appointments upon political grounds, except in the case of clerkships. To this usage I not only adhered, but extended it to include the clerkships also. The chief clerk, who had been removed by my predecessor, had peculiar qualifications for the place, and although known to me only officially, he was restored to the position. It will probably be conceded by all who are well informed on the subject that his restoration was a benefit to the public service. Footnote 11. Soon after my entrance upon duty as Secretary of War, General Jessup, the Quartermaster General, presented to me a list of names from which to make selection of a clerk for his department. Observing that he had attached certain figures to these names, I asked whether the figures were intended to indicate the relative qualifications or preference in his estimation of the several applicants, and upon his answer in the affirmative, without further question, authorized him to appoint number 1 of his list. A day or two afterward, certain Democratic members of Congress called on me and politely inquired whether it was true that I had appointed a Whig to a position in the War Office. Certainly not, I answered. We thought you were not aware of it, said they, and proceeded to inform me that Mr. Blank, the recent appointee to the clerkship just mentioned, was a Whig. After listening patiently to this statement, I answered that it was they who were deceived, not I. I had appointed a clerk. He had been appointed neither as a Whig nor as a Democrat, but merely as the fittest candidate for the place in the estimation of the chief of the bureau to which it belonged. I further gave them to understand that the same principle of selection would be followed in similar cases, so far as my authority extended. After some further discussion of the question, the visitors withdrew, dissatisfied with the result of the interview. The Quartermaster General, on hearing of this conversation, hastened to inform me that it was all a mistake, that the appointee to the office had been confounded with his father, who was a well-known Whig, but that he, the son, was a Democrat. I assured the General that this was altogether immaterial, adding that it was a very pretty quarrel as it stood, and that I had no desire to effect a settlement of it on any inferior issue. Thenceforward, however, I was but little troubled with any pressure for political appointments in the department. The reader desirous for further information relative to the administration of the War Department during this period may find it in the various official reports and estimates of works of defense prosecuted or recommended, arsenals of construction and depots of arms maintained or suggested, and foundries employed during the presidency of Mr. Pierce, 1853 57. Having been again elected by the legislature of Mississippi as Senator to the United States, I passed from the cabinet of Mr. Pierce on the last day of his term, March 4th, 1857, to take my seat in the Senate. The administration of Franklin Pierce presents the only instance in our history of the continuance of the cabinet for 4 years without a single change in its personnel. When it is remembered that there was much dissimilarity, if not incongruity of character, among the members of that cabinet, some idea may be formed of the power over men possessed and exercised by Mr. Pierce. Chivalrous, generous, amiable, true to his friends and to his faith, frank and bold in the declaration of his opinions, he never deceived any one. And if treachery had ever come near him, it would have stood abashed in the presence of his truth, his manliness, and his confiding simplicity. End of chapter 4.